Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. You are most welcome to this first webinar. It's a cycle of webinars that Latindadd is organizing on the fair financing for climate. This first webinar is a global dialogue on debt, climate, and debt for nature swaps. Thanks for being connected today to all the participants and also to our experts that will be part of the panel today. The objective of this webinar is to have a dialogue on economic and climate justice, and mostly focusing on analyzing the relationship between the high levels of indebtedness in countries of the Global South. We have seen an interesting and very alarming report from UNCTAD about the debt situation and the debt context in our countries, and also to touch on what is the relationship with the climate crisis. We want to address as well what is the burden of private creditors and under the current context and the current landscape. And currently, as we have seen, the main solutions for debt in several of our countries in the South is debt for nature or debt for climate swaps that are different from the traditional ones that we have known in the past in our regions, and that are strongly promoted in the international arena as an alternative to solve not only debt, but also the climate crisis. So we want to dig more into what does this mean, what are the impacts, and what are the alerts that we want to put on the table around these initiatives. So I will start introducing our speakers, our experts. I would like to introduce first to Daniel Munevar. He was a former advisor to Yanis Varoufakis at the Ministry of Finance of the Hellenic Republic. In the past, he worked as a fiscal advisor to the Ministry of Finance of Colombia and special advisor on foreign direct investment for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ecuador. He has a master's in public affairs from the LBJ School at the University of Texas, Austin, and he is currently Economic Affairs Officer at the Debt and Development Finance Branch at UNCTAD. We have also our colleague May Buenaventura. She currently manages the Debt Justice Program of Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, APMDD. She's based in the Philippines. She has done research and written on various development finance and debt justice issues relating them, among others, to the climate crisis and women, to particular conditions in Asian countries, and she also works on the concept of illegitimate debts. We have also Yolanda Fresnillo. Yolanda is the Policy and Advocacy Manager on Debt Justice at EURODAD, the European Network on Debt and Development. Over the last 2 decades, Yolanda has been closely involved in local, national, and international social movements and has campaigned on development finance and debt. Yolanda has a master's in development and cooperation and business administration, a BA in sociology, both from the University of Barcelona. We are also glad to have today Daniel Ortega. He has a PhD in public policy and administration from Ohio State University, a Master of Applied Economics from Michigan State University, and Bachelor of Agricultural Sciences from Earth University. He is a co-chairman of the panel of experts of the Voluntary Market Integrity Council of Carbon. He was former Minister of the Environment of Ecuador and was a member of the Council of the Global Environment Fund. And we also have Adrian Chikowore. Adrian is a policy analyst focused on international public and private finance portfolio with AFRODA, the African Forum on Debt and Development. He has 9 years of experience working in national, regional, and international NGOs. He has a PhD fellow He is a PhD fellow focusing on infrastructure finance in Africa. He holds a Master of Science in African Studies degree and honors degree in international studies. I would like to remind everyone that we have a translation English, Spanish, so please select the language of your that is most convenient for you. We will have the structure of the webinar today is we will have each of our speakers having a presentation of 10 minutes, and then we will have a room in this webinar to have questions, answers, and comments. So without further delay, I would like to start inviting our speakers, and the first one is Daniel Munevar from UNCTAD. Daniel, please.
Thanks, Patricia, and thanks for the invitation. So I would like to start and end with the issue of the debt for nature swaps, which is of course the topic of the webinar. So I think one of the key issues to understand of why all of the sudden debt for nature swaps have become so popular again is that they sit at the confluence of a series of factors that include systemic failures, a systemic failure of the international financial architecture, and factors of supply and demand. So in the case of the issue of the systemic failure, I think a key problem that developing countries have always dealt with, but it's even more pressing now, is that their capacity to access resources to finance their development is being hampered by a series of exogenous shocks of crisis. And this is putting countries in a very difficult position where there are simply no good choices to be made in order basically to continue access financing and make it to the next year. And when we look at how the countries are basically in need of tapping this sort of financing, this is the supply of basically the stock of debt that can be swapped. And then on the other side of that, you have a niche industry in the financial sector that is after a very profitable but a small corner of financial markets that through basically opacity and obfuscation are making substantial profits out of this debt swaps, and they're basically taking advantage of the difficulties of countries of accessing financing in conditions that are on conditions that basically allow them to achieve long-term development. So in how we got this situation is how the report that the UN did fills into this picture. I'm going to share my screen. So a month ago, the UN published this report called A World of Debt, and this is the result of a UN-wide effort involving not only UNCTAD, but also regional all of the regional economic commissions of the UN. And it was precisely an attempt to try to understand how there has been a buildup of debt distress over the last decade. And implicitly, one of the key issues that we're trying to zero in is this basically narrative that is coming out specifically from the IMF, in which the problem of debt distress is described as basically a focalized problem that is only affecting a small number of countries. But what we did with this report was to show, and as the UN Secretary General pointed out, is that what we're dealing at this point is not even an issue of systemic risk. It's a problem of systemic failure, where we have around 3.3 billion people living in countries that are spending more on interest than they are spending on either education or healthcare. So it's a very pressing problem. And it is precisely because countries are trying to deal with this very pressing problem that end up involved in operations such as swaps that don't necessarily solve the structural problems that they are dealing with. So the report shows that since over the last 2 decades, the total public debt of all the world has reached $92 trillion, has increased by a factor of 5 over the last two decades. And we are in a situation in which basically around 70% of the public debt of the world is owed by developed countries, and only 30% is owed by developing countries. And this is quite of interesting, and it's one of the paradoxes that we would also like to highlight, that we live in a very unequal, and actually, again, as the SG of the UN pointed out, on a financial system of a colonial nature, because even though developed countries are the ones that have most of the debt, they are the ones that can actually access financing in better terms compared to developing countries. And this is one of the big barriers for development that these countries are facing. If we look at the growth over the last decade, what we're finding is that actually most of the places where debt grew the most were actually in developing countries over the last decade. And this has left us in a situation where over the first 10 years of the decade, the amount of countries that had high levels of debt was declining, thanks in part to the super commodity cycle and the HIPC MDRI debt relief initiative. Basically, since the turn of the decade after the global financial crisis, the number of countries with high debt levels has been increasing, and it peaked right in the aftermath of the COVID shock, reaching 72 countries. And the problem is that this accumulation of debt is a bigger problem for developing countries. Why? Because of the role of external debt, because they're facing much larger borrowing costs, and also because they are being the most affected by cascading crises that include the COVID-19 pandemic, the cost of living crisis, and climate change. And what we're seeing is that precisely one of the drivers of this accumulation of debt is external public debt. And one of the key indicators of how burdensome this debt is the external public debt service relative to exports, which for developing countries reached as a median 7.4% in 2021. Why is this important? Because in 1953, in the context of the London Agreement to deal with Germany's war debts, this agreement set a cap of 5% of total external debt service for Germany at 5%. So that means that currently developing countries are paying more than the cap that was imposed for the creditors of Germany, in an attempt precisely to ensure that Germany had enough resources to secure a recovery from the war. Now, developing countries as a whole are actually paying more, and just the public sector is paying more than this cap. And this accumulation of debt also has a very particular characteristic, which is that the component that has grown the most over the last 10 years is the private component. So if we look for developing countries as a whole, the share of private creditors in external public debt grew from 47 to 62%. And if we look across regions, basically you see this pattern of how basically the accumulation of public debt owed to private creditors is the main driver of accumulation of debt, which then creates a series of complexities in the case of debt restructuring. And this accumulation of debt and the resources that are required for it are leaving more and more countries dealing with this problem, which is either they service their debt or they actually provide services to their people. And how can we see that? We see it that in the number of countries that are allocating now more than 10% of the revenues to pay interest on total public debt has increased from 29 to 50 over the last decade, peaking at 54 in 2020. we have a situation where now the net interest payments of developing countries on total public debt represent almost 7% of their government of their government revenues. And we have a situation in which, if you look at all of the patterns of expenditure of developing countries, you compare how much they are paying on interest on total public debt, and you compare it to how much paying on education, on investment, and health. Actually, interest on public debt is the fastest growing component of public expenditure, which shows how much this is a brewing problem that is about to get much worse given the increase in global interest rates. And how can we highlight what is the price that this imposes on people? This is the evolution of countries that are spending more on interest than either education, investment, or health over the last decade. And you can see how in all the cases, this number of countries is steadily increasing over the last decade. And this has left us in a situation where, again, 3.3 billion people are living in countries that spend more on interest than education or health. So this dynamic of brewing that distress, and basically the fact that we have a system that doesn't have an answer on how to provide access to financing to developing countries, that doesn't have an answer on how to deal with this with that distress, then it's basically leaving developing countries that have an obligation to basically ensure the provision of public goods to its citizens, to basically look for second best alternative for debt swaps. But that is creating its own set of problems, and I'll stop here to respect the time, in the sense that these are operations that are representing a setback in terms of international debt transparency efforts, as basically none of the documentation on these transactions, contractual documentation, is publicly available, where countries have to pay transaction fees that are extremely high for a debt operation, and which is the reason why they became so attractive for intermediaries in this transaction, and that are financial transactions that don't comply with the minimum requirement of ESG bond issuance in terms of third-party verification, which makes them pliable to greenwashing. That is basically that the commitments that are in the bond are not fulfilled, which represents a problem for the country, but also for the investors in this assets. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And you put really strong issues on the table, the systemic failure, and how currently that is not really being resolved at all. The risk that people is facing in our countries by these higher interest payments, if we compare them with the expenditures on social expenditures particularly. And you bring something interesting that I catch, that is probably we need to review more with this data. We need to review more what are the debt limits and to include debt servicing limits in the methodologies and when we talk about sustainability. You have also addressed the issue on climate, and you started to talk about the greenwashing and what is the relationship with the bonds and the private sector burden in the current portfolio of debt in our countries. So with this, I would like to give the floor to May Buenaventura. APMDB has been linking strongly in the last years what are the challenges between debt and climate crisis, and what are the main needs and demands from the South. May, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you to Latindadd also for this opportunity. And thank you as well to Danielle, who really laid out the context of this terrible situation that we're in. And so let me share my screen for a while. Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly of how, because of pre-existing challenges and issues unmet and unresolved over the years, all this has come together, come to a head, no? And really exacerbated the suffering of people and communities. So I don't need to make the case anymore. It's pretty much obvious that the debt and climate crisis are really mutually reinforcing. And we can see that how this is connected, that significantly the countries in debt crisis are also amongst the most vulnerable, amongst the most climate threatened in the world. And many reports and documented cases how debt problems worsen after climate disaster. Just looking at it at the micro scale, farmer suicides related to sinking into unpayable debt after a climate disaster that wipes out their produce and their harvest. No? So on a national basis, this is true as well. No? And there's information that 80% of these cases, the government that was hired 2 years after disasters. Also, climate-related losses are very much related to deeper debt dependence and accumulation. So the V20, for example, the vulnerable 20 group, says that up to 40 billion of additional interest payments over the past 10 years that is its projection. And over the next decade, this number is projected to balloon to 168 billion. So it's a truly grim outlook for global South countries, as I don't need to elaborate anymore how we've seen this accelerate during the COVID pandemic. And it was not a debt crisis that just erupted overnight, but built from many years previous to that, of depending so much on debt and accumulating debt. So that really accelerated during COVID. There's also been increased exposure to private creditors, especially bondholders, higher interest rates, and of course, failed and flawed debt relief measures put forward by the G20 and the Paris Club that have really not really debt relief, not relief in that sense. And so it now comes back with a backlash, but countries are at this time burdened with more debt that was accumulated due to COVID. So these are just some examples of, I just highlighted some of the examples of these countries. You know very well what happened to Sri Lanka, and it is currently undergoing domestic debt restructuring as required by external creditors, required by the IMF as well. And it has been eating into the pension funds of millions of workers, specifically the Employee Provident Fund, and also Pakistan, which has been bailed out recently, but many see this as not really giving it that breathing spell as hope. Add to that the surcharges that it has to pay because it has borrowed more than its quota. For Bangladesh, the same, loan repayments going up. Also for Mongolia, which was about to default but issued a bond. So in effect, it borrowed to pay its loans. IMF also gave it a bailout of 440 million. And this required, of course, the conditionalities that we are very well aware of. So looking more closely at Pakistan, we still know that it has not recovered from the historic floods of last year. And there's still millions, including millions of children who are without access to safe drinking water. So now it's in this critical debt distress situation, suffering also at the same time from the impacts of the climate-related flooding due to glacial melt, and yet we see how little it is responsible for in the climate crisis. The estimate is 0.3% of cumulative global carbon dioxide emissions. So this is just a map on the right of some of the countries that are vulnerable. There's more than 10, no? But these are some of the Asian countries, and they're also among the most debt distressed. So it's very clear, even like Macron and many other countries recognize that there's a urgent need for massive climate finance. No? So far, the estimates, the pledges, I mean, of 100 billion a year, which is very, very inadequate, has not been fulfilled. And it also comes in great part as loans and flows primarily to climate mitigation. Developing countries have identified adaptation needs as greater and more urgent, and yet the money flows to mitigation. So, for example, in 2020, 29 billion went to support adaptation, and you compare this to 49 billion that funded mitigation, according to the OECD. Also, from the Climate Policy Initiative, that the world spends less than 50 billion a year on adaptation, or less than 10% of total climate investments. And as we go through this crisis, of course, the adaptation costs are rising, and the UN Environmental Program estimates this to rise to 500 billion by 2050. So it's very clear here in the box I have on the right, the commitment or the recognition of the responsibility of industrialized countries to support efforts, no? To survive the climate crisis, but of course it's blatantly violated. Okay. Okay, so these are just some graphics showing the huge needs for loss and damage. So as you know, at the last COP, a mechanism was set up for funding loss and damage, but still it's surrounded by a lot of questions like where will the funds come from? How will you determine loss and the level of loss and damage and so on. So, but the numbers here are huge, and considering these numbers, it is really tragic or shocking and tragic to see that against these needs, the fossil fuel industry continues to profit so much. So if you look at this little dot here, that is the finance put forward by governments to address loss and damage, and the big black circle are the average fossil fuels super profits from 91 to 20. So the source of this is down below. No? There's also been some interrogations into what is this, what is really being given as climate finance. So this report, for example, from the India's Ministry of Finance, they found out that out of the nearly 62 billion that developed countries claimed to have provided in 2014, only 2.2 billion was actually disbursed. And other evidence that of the total funds provided by developed countries in 2020 alone, which 68.1 billion was public finance, while the rest was private. So of this figure, as much as 48.6 billion came in the form of loans, and only 17.6 billion were given as grants. Also, this one shows that of the loans extended, more than half of the 46 billion in loans provided as climate finance are increasingly non-concessional. So from 2015 to 2016, you see this green portion, and that has shrunk in 2017 and 2018, and that may be an ongoing, continuing trend. So some of the challenges are, of course, this continued double speak by the IFI. So, for example, Urgewald reported that the World Bank has very much supported the fossil fuel industry since the past climate agreement. No, so there's 12 billion in direct project finance, and also indirect support given to government budget support without parameters or restrictions against fossil fuel spending, billions also in fossil fuel enabling infrastructure, and other examples here. So I also cite an example from my country in holding the World Bank's International Finance Corporation, its private sector arm, which provided millions of dollars to a local bank, which then extended funds to finance 19 new coal power plants across the country, despite the World Bank's having pledged stopping funding coal in 2013. So recently we've heard of the evolutionary roadmap, but it's sometimes it's been described as a destination unknown, because but maybe if we look at it, we can see where it's leading, because there's still the mantra of leveraging private sector finance through public funds, and there's also stress on public-private partnerships, which have problems of their own, and fiscal risks in terms of accumulating debt, also offering more loans and debt suspension, not really debt relief. Also, the questions about where is the accountability and acknowledgement for the record of dirty energy support, and that impact has often been irreversible and continuing. So even if it happened in the past, it continues to be felt by communities, no, and other marginalized groups. So we also continue to, it also continues to be silent on human rights, and doesn't really respond to the criticism that these the World Bank and IMF are human rights free zones, no? And there's no really any semblance of alignment with human rights and environmental protection and sustainability. So for the IMF, we know about the RST, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which in the way it is set up, it really ends up reproducing and reinforcing the coloniality of climate and debt. So in effect, it results in expanding the powers of this discredited institution. It also requires countries to be under a lending program with the fund, and that carries, of course, austerity measures and other conditions. And it's also contingent on rich countries' donations of unused SDRs, which hasn't really happened. We also remain critical of the debt sustainability framework, which remains narrowly about capacity to pay in full and on time, and still persistently silent on human rights, inequality within countries and between lenders and borrowers, and detached from globally agreed development agenda. So also with a common framework, well, we've seen how it's been dragging for several years now, and it's actually losing its relevance, like other debt relief schemes in the past. Still limited to bilateral creditors and shows no intent at all to cover previously large debt exposures of low-income countries to IFIs and private lenders. And it's also very clear that it was motivated from the very start by the desire that even in the face of staggering multiple crises, I'm sorry, there's error here, that the LICs, they really wanted to see that the LICs would continue to pay. Still, the exclusion of middle-income countries, though many are similarly situated as LICs, and the very apparent lack of transparency about the terms, the amounts, transparency principles drafted by a group of commercial investment banks, asset managers, hedge funds, and so on. And still, borrowers are not at the table, and still borrowers are being blamed, no? As has been done many years in the past. So we need to see the debt and climate crisis at its roots, which means looking at the global economic and financial system that really is founded on plunder, enriches itself from a net outflow of resources from the south to the north. We also have seen how this system has concentrated wealth in the hands of a few, And we now have this financial system that is extractivist and exploitative and in the service of profit accumulation at the expense of millions of people and the environment. So it's also very much to answer for the destruction of the environment and putting us in this vulnerability to the climate crisis because of the impunity of natural resource extraction. This includes the destruction of natural carbon sinks and the excessive and ever-increasing emissions of GHGs from fossil fuel use. So even though there is international recognition of the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, this is observed more in the breach rather than in fact. And also with the debt crisis, we've seen in history how this has been pushed upon the South with the reasoning that our economies need capital infusion because we're poor and we need these loans to develop. But how that has gone over many years, it has brought us to this vicious cycle, trapped us in this cycle of borrowing to repay loans. So our call is really, it's time for a reparations agenda. We have to stress that, you know, as Daniel also earlier mentioned, the debt colonialism, climate colonialism, this demands looking into the roots of the crisis and the justness of demanding finance for reparations, equity, and justice, starting with the implementation of real, durable, and just solutions. So for rich countries, because of their heavier share of responsibility for climate change, they need to fulfill the obligation to deliver climate finance. And that is how climate finance is actually defined. It's not just any finance, but finance to help the global South recover from and survive in the climate crisis. And part of that is recognizing adaptation as a global good and therefore having funds flowing more to that as compared to mitigation. And of course, dealing with loss and damage, which is the situation when many of us can no longer adapt because it is so dire. We're not absolving our own governments, which means this also involves a transformation of national economies, not simply through, separate piecemeal measures, but really an overhaul of those economies. And on debt, we stand that debt cancellation is really what's urgently needed, and funds freed from this should urgently go into public goods and services, as well as addressing the injustice. And of course, global systemic changes must also take place. Okay, so I think that's my last slide. Okay.
Thanks so much,
Thank
May.
you, Patricia.
Thank you so much, May, for bringing all this strong data that is reflecting the urgency, though we are already living the impacts in our countries. And also, thanks for raising the situation of middle-income countries that from the beginning of the current crisis have been left out of any global policy, and for bringing what is the debt and climate vicious cycle that our countries are living and really cannot have and find a solution without fair financing. I would like to give now the floor to Yolanda Fresnillo from Eurodadd, because and May has brought all the issues around the problem of debt and climate all together as two crises that are unfolding at the same time, one unfolding the other and the other way around as well. Yolanda, are debt for nature swaps a good alternative? What can you tell us about all the recent experiences that countries in the South are going through, are having, and debt swaps now are being put on the table more often for other countries. We have been listening about climate and debt swaps for climate for the Amazons, for instance. So what are the current experiences? What can you tell us about them? Yolanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Gracias, Patricia. I'm gonna speak in English and share my screen. Thanks a lot to Latindadd for inviting me, but also for organizing this very interesting, hopefully interesting, but mostly very timely event and debate, and I hope it's the first of many, not the first, but one of many. As Daniel was saying, and Patricia was also saying, now there is a new surge of debt swaps and a new modality of debt swaps, debt for nature and debt for climate swaps. Given, as Daniel was saying before, given the twin crises that are heavily interlinked, as Maya was saying, of debt, over indebtedness, and the climate emergency, and debt swaps are presented as a possible way out for both crises at the same time. So a solution that could help tackling the need for debt reduction, at the same time as needing resources to invest on climate resilience, on conservation, nature conservation, but also on SDGs, on health and other issues. The first, I would say, is that debt swaps are not new. These debt swaps that we are hearing about lately might seem new, but the rationale behind them, methodology is different, but the rationale behind them is very similar to the previous rounds and experiences of debt swaps. And debt swaps have been there since the late 80s, and we have plenty of experience, not so positive experiences of debt swaps. I'll go into the detail later on, but one of the main things that this experience have shown us is that debt swaps are not a good instrument to address the debt crisis. They have other problems, but if we take into account the dimension of the problems that both Daniel and May outlined here, it is clear to us, to anyone that has studied and followed these instruments, even the new modality of these instruments, that these are not fit for purpose as a solution to this crisis. I'll go a little bit more into detail. As Patricia was saying, there's this new type of debt for climate, debt for nature swaps. They basically involve private creditors, private bondholders. At least these are most of the experiences that we're seeing. They are promoted by private foundations, private philanthropies like TNC, the National Conservative, also other organizations, involving what we could define, and we will see several examples today, complex and opaque. These for me are the two main characteristics: complex and non-transparent transactions with private creditors, banks, but also involving insurance companies, development finance institutions, for instance, the US Development Finance Agency, and also multilateral development banks like the Inter-American Development Bank. As I said, this is one kind of debt swaps. There have been in the past also what we can call bilateral debt swaps with a debtor country and a creditor country. Also what we can call third-party involvement debt swaps, like the ones that the Global Fund did on health, debt for health swaps, and this new, what we could call private sector involvement debt swaps are a new category. But I wanted to give this idea or this context that debt swaps go beyond what we're seeing these days with the debt for nature and debt for conservation swaps. What is a debt swap? The classic debt for development or debt for SDGs swaps are financing mechanisms involving sovereign debts, public debts, intended for development purposes. In this case, in these new cases, it's also climate and conservation, environmental purposes. And what we could call the classic scheme of a debt swaps involves an operation in which part of the amount that a country owes is no longer claimed by the creditor. It's canceled or it's written off, is reduced on the condition that the amount equivalent to the reduced debt or part of it is invested in a development project or an infrastructure. These new debt swaps are slightly different because they normally involve what is called a debt buyback. So there are some resources in most of the cases with the issuance of a new debt bond by a third party, in many cases what it's called a special purpose vehicle, that they issue a blue bond or a green bond, and with this money they lend to the debtor country, and the debtor country buys the debt that it has with financial markets at a discount. With this discount is the part of the reduction of the debt, and commits to invest part of these savings into a conservation or a climate-related investment. I know it seems complicated, and it is complicated. But it's important to understand how this new modality of debt swaps is making debt swaps a little bit more complex. We have a partner last year that issued a statement, an article not long ago saying these are not debt swaps. These are something different. We're calling that debt swaps, but they are something different. Let me put the example of Belize. I know Daniel Ortega will speak later about Ecuador, and we can also have a look at the details of Gabon, which is one of the most recent examples. The Belize Blue Bond and Debt Swap was made in 2021 with the support of the Nature Conservative, one of these foundations that are pushing for debt swaps. I would say the main one, and Credit Suisse. Now changing to another institution. It was presented as a big success and as a way forward to be scaled up and replicated. And actually, the case of Ecuador has been presented as the scaling up of the Belize example, although the actors involved are a little bit different. And the case of Belize, as I was saying before, consists on a debt buyback. So the country buys back bonds that are in the financial markets of a debt worth $546 million that were due in 2034, and that were being exchanged at a very low rate, at a lower value in the financial markets. So bondholders have been paid with the proceeds of a new blue bond that this special purpose vehicle put on the market, so-called blue bond. So-called because at the time there wasn't any indication of how blue bonds should be and what the characteristics they should have. And it seems that the inclusion of the conservation of a conservation trust played a key role in securing support from the bondholders in the restructuring that supposed a haircut, supposed a slight debt reduction in the money that Belize owed to the financial markets at that time. In exchange of that operation, Belize established a trust fund worth $23 million CD amounts. So the initial debt was 546 million, and the amount devoted to the conservation was a little bit less than 10% of the savings from the amount of the restructuring haircut to protect coral reefs. Belize also committed to replenish this trust fund throughout the years. This is an attempt, I'm not gonna go through this scheme, but this is an attempt to explain how the structure of the Belize debt swap worked. It's just to give you a visual image of this complexity of the operation. As I said, I can go back to it if there is questions, or I can answer questions in another moment, but I just wanted to show how complex the whole operation was. Eurodadd published in right after the deal was done, and I have to say that it was our colleague Daniel Munevar, working at Eurodadd at that time, that authored this report on debt swap. And one of the main criticisms that we had for this operation is that beyond the lack of transparency, beyond the lack of civil society participation that I will speak on in a minute, the operation was made under the assumption of a very harsh fiscal consolidation. So the operation was presented as a way to restoring debt sustainability from the IMF and World Bank perspective in Ecuador, in Belize, sorry. And indeed, Belize has improve its fiscal balance, and according to the last reports from the IMF, debt sustainability has been restored. Has it been thanks to the swap, or at what cost? Well, we still have to look into the details of it, because the data is very new, but apparently the swap played a role in this restoring of debt sustainability, but there have been other elements, including, for instance, spending restraint, which is another word for austerity, including a temporary, let's see if they recover that, 10% cut in all public sector wages, the suspension of public sector wage increments in 2021 and 2022. But also another deal with a major bilateral creditor, which in this case was Venezuela, and other elements, including high inflation in the country. And if you look at the data, you see how while Belize managed to increase their tax revenue, this fiscal consolidation and this recuperation of the debt sustainability is mainly due to cuts in current expenditure. So to austerity measures, which means, as our colleague Daniel said in November 2021, that the fiscal adjustment required to actually give the results that the debt swap was promising would imply that the ocean conservation would come at the expense of poverty reduction, health, and education. Unfortunately, the reality has been given Daniel, has proved Daniel right. Beyond that, and as I was saying, the debt swap was surrounded by a lot of opacity, by lack of civil society participation, based on a selective approach to creditor participation, and offered insufficient debt relief. So I'm going to finish by answering the question that Patricia posed. Are debt swaps a solution? Are debt swaps killing two birds with one stone, or are they just a smokescreen? Well, even when well designed, because they could be well designed, they could be transparent, they could have civil society participation, they could have enough debt cancellation. Even then, they haven't proved an effective tool to solve the debt problem. And I think this is important. They can be complementary to debt cancellation. They can be complementary to debt restructuring, to deep debt restructuring, if done all right, which is not the case for what we're seeing today. So I'm going to go onto the limitations quickly. Unlikely to cancel enough debt, as I was saying, to contribute to solving the debt crisis, but also unlikely to liberate enough funds to meaningfully contribute to climate change or to nature goals. They can open the door, as we have seen in the past with previous debt swaps, to conditionality, to tight aid. We have examples, for instance, in my country, in Spain, how the Spanish government in the past used debt swaps to impose Spanish corporations in operations in Latin American countries like Cuba, for instance, El Salvador, Ecuador, and others. They can undermine civil society participation, and then they can undermine democratic ownership. And I think Daniel Ortega is going to speak a little bit about this in his presentation on Ecuador. They are usually very slow, burdensome, and opaque processes with high transaction costs. So these organizations that are pushing for it, they are getting quite some money to make the deal, to make the operation happen. They could also add budgetary pressure. If these debts are unsustainable and the country cannot pay these debts that are being swapped, how they can have the money to invest in conservation, in climate, et cetera, because they are not additional to climate finance. They are not additional to ODA commitments. And there is a risk, and it has happened before, of double counting, of counting ODA, debt swaps as ODA when the initial loan was already counted as ODA. This is in the case of bilateral debt swaps. They can also work against the principle of fair share of debt treatment amongst different creditors, because it normally involves only one type of creditor. Obviously, they can legitimize illegitimate debt that shouldn't be paid. And finally, and for me, this is the most important thing that we need to discuss, is for debt for climate and debt for nature swaps, particularly, not to distract the attentions away from the solutions that we need, which is debt cancellation, international financial architecture reform, to address the debt crisis. This is a quote, and I'm finalizing with this, from actually an internal document that the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, Eurodadd, Latindadd, and Debt Justice worked for Climate Action International, from Climate Action Network International. There's a word missing here. And actually, CAN International has adopted it as its their own policy, admitting that there can pose significant risks and challenges, actually causing harm to the global south. I'm going to finish by saying that debt swaps could be positive if they are well designed. Could be positive in terms of, releasing some resources, having some small impact on debt burden, but they are not the solution. So it can be done well. It could be positive in some cases, but what we are seeing today, it's not that. It's, again, non-transparent, non-participatory, and not really supporting a real solution to the debt and the climate emergency. Thanks. I'm going to finish here.
Thanks so much, Yolanda, for introducing what are debt swaps, what are we talking about when we are hearing these latest initiatives. And well, it calls my attention what you mentioned about probably this is not the right name. We people that used to follow all these initiatives for probably 2 decades, these are different. Probably we need to think in a different name to call these initiatives, from at least from our end. And whether, as you exactly mentioned, whether it's not, it doesn't provide a debt resolution, But if it's well designed, if it has principles of transparency, sovereignty, prioritizing climate and people interests and benefit over private interests mainly, probably for this small portion of a debt portfolio could work. So what happened in Ecuador? And I'm going to give the floor to Daniel Ortega from Ecuador. And he strongly raised the case of Galapagos debt swap. There is a very strong and solid analysis that Daniel launched along with Latindadd, Irodadd, and other allies this year. Daniel, please, the floor is yours.
Muy buenos días. Thank you very much, Patricia, for this invitation and the timely event. Let me join Yolanda and Daniel and just to congratulate this effort. I think it is important. This is the right time. We are in the phase to approach both the UN Secretary General Assembly and also the follow-up discussion on Paris. So having this reflection, exploring ways to make this instrument fit for purpose. Currently, it's not, as we have seen from the empirical evidence. But I think that our contributions could be of utmost importance. So if I may, before I jump into the slides, I just want to, despite this gloomy picture of what is going on with respect to debt solutions and restructuring, I think that what's just recently happening in Ecuador with respect to the national referendum, that opening up a public dialogue with respect to keeping the oil on the ground as a move forward to the climate solution, I think that is a great happy news for all of us. So I just want to emphasize that. I think this has been the struggle of different social movements for over 10 years that shows and brings hope to what we're doing, that at the end of the day, it is on people also to be able to request accountability and to request changes. And I think perhaps Ecuador is an example of many things at this point in time. On the one hand, people assuming their own responsibility when they have to vote to decide their development pathway, but also perhaps people on the ground will also mobilize additional action to request accountability with respect to swaps and other activities by government. Having said that, let me just swiftly move to our discussion today. I will be sharing slides in Spanish and we'll be trying to convey some key messages while I speak in English. Perhaps one major central axis of this presentation is that we need to start thinking on management of sustainability as a joint endeavor of both ensuring long-term fiscal stability while at the same time delivering on sustainability. And I think they are both intrinsically related as branches of the same strand. And I will briefly go into why this debt swap came about, perhaps an initial analysis of winners and losers, and some takeaways that we can take with us, building on previous presentation. I will try not to be repetitive as much as I can. But let me start by perhaps, if I can summarize previous presentation, I think that what we are trying to see is an optimal management of debt, given the high indebtedness of many of the countries in the face of climate change and the need for transition. So if this is the case, we are talking about the reduction of total debt and the service in the present, so that we can ensure an intergenerational management of the climate change issue, conservation, and so on. And this can be achieved through efficiency for the redistribution and stability. Alternatives, in the case of Ecuador, the problem is really high. We are talking about $68 billion in debt. And we know for certain that the service of the debt will increase heavily starting next year, but peaking by 2026. And we also know for sure that the income from oil extraction and exploitation will be limited, and it's quite uncertain given the global energy transition. So if this is the case, any country, not only Ecuador, we need to think about having a renewed social pact on the ground, and this pact should be aligned with an overall transition by 2050, right? We need to reduce 50% of emission by 2030 and 100% of emissions achieve net zero by 2050. If this is the case, every country needs a real plan that should be built from bottom up. And such a plan or such a transition effort would need a full restructuring and a new proposal for management. And that is a sustainable financing strategy that will undertake restructuring, renegotiation of debt, perhaps new instruments like thematic bonds to support it, but at the center of it, relief and best cases of debt swaps may become handy. In the case of ECO, we had several alternatives. The Galapagos was just only one. There have been other proposals. One element that we have questioned about this is that in the case of Ecuador, the swap didn't start because Ecuador was seeking for it. It was presented, it was a proposal presented by private actors within specific objectives, and they have made every single effort to make it through. It is not part of an entire national strategy. So this is something that we need to think about, because it's a way to preempt the potential for this. But also the question is, why the country, if having a need, didn't open up a bit for different proposals for different actors, but essentially marry with the first idea that came to them. And why that's what came about. Yes, there is a threat. Right? There is overfishing, unsustainable fishing going around the marine reserves, and the picture at your right shows in blue light a color the frontiers of many of the marine reserves in the at least surrounding Latin America, and in yellow is the presence of Chinese vessels, but we can think about other vessels as well. It's just overexploitation of marine resources is really the threat. How to manage it, how to preserve it in terms that makes it is consistent with national regulations and goals. That's the central question. We were talking about in yellow. You are seeing the new protected area that has been put forward from Ecuador in the last few years, which is called Reserva Hermandad. Reserva Hermandad, it is inside the current marine reserve of Galapagos, right? So it is not an additional area of protection. It's just within it. What it's attempting to do is to improve management of it. And it may be necessary because of control and surveillance. We are neighboring this area with Costa Rica, and we will hope that the same efforts are conducting at the other hand of the river, let's say. The total management budget for this reserve was estimated about $45 million for the next 5 years, and that is $9 million a year. So the debt swap was motivated to provide this funding, but perhaps also satisfy other financial needs of Galapagos. Galapagos faces about a fiscal deficit of annual fiscal deficit before the Hermandad of 20 million. Despite the debt swap, there remains an 11.5 million per year of deficit. And please keep in mind that these budget needs have not considered the impacts of climate change. And we are about to change the strongest El Niño we have ever faced. And we are expecting a really large loss on our side. So to finance this financial need, if we summarize what Yolanda has already presented, I will not take much time on this, but in blue, you have the traditional debt instrument, right? But now we have a different blueprint. In the past, essentially a project was to receive the benefits of the payment of any debts between a government and a provider of finance. Now it has shifted so that the payment of this debt is replaced with a new loan, and the loan is financed through the issuance of a bond in the international markets. Who backs the bond? What type of guarantees the country has and the private actors have to improve the profile of the investment? And that is the reduction of the risk associated with the instruments is what is of concern, the overall transaction cost, the pace of commissions, and at the end of the day, also what this new contract that supports the loan entails in terms of collective class actions against a country if decides even to pay upfront the debt, right? If the country would like to pay faster, and not in the 18 years that have been set up, it will be very costly for the country overall. So I will not go into every specific element, but just to show the complexity of the entire operation, this entails a full set of actors in the private sector. And the underlying motivation for this is that there is public finance available, right? Like from the European Union to support private investor managers to mobilize resources and to leverage private finance. But at the end of the day, this is public funding that is enabling risky activities in the financial sector, and governments have to pay for the guarantees to make sure that they will fulfill their contracts. And that is, it comes at a cost. And at the end of the day, the resources will be managed by the private actors, regardless of any type of governance approach. In the case of Ecuador, we're talking about a debt swap of about $1.6 billion in the market. The bonds in the market were bought at really large discounted prices, given the high indebtedness and the high risk profiles. So we bought back 1.6 billion with only 656 million, right? So that's about 60% of reduction on the total value. Bringing this up to net present value is about 40%. So the reduction in the debt service is of 1.1 billion, and the net savings that will be accrued will be transferred to an international endowment. The issue is how this buyback is financed. The buyback is financed with the issuance of a bond that has been perhaps incorrectly defined as a conservation-linked bond because it does not follow international practices or the European taxonomy and guidance for the issuance of thematic bonds. And the interest rate difference between the apologies for that. The interest rate rate difference between the issued bond and the loan provides also for an opportunity to manage additional financing, right? The difference is yet transferred to the country because the full interest of the loan has to be paid. And the resources, again, are transferred to the International Endowment Fund that has been set up in Delaware. The bond was issued by a legal entity registered in Ireland. Both of them are technically considered tax havens, and which facilitates the overall transaction cost of the finance, but reduce the transparency and accountability. And when you look at the total amount that is transferred because of the payment of the loan and the spread of the proceeds of the bond, there is a specific policy of the endowment that will only finance 50% of the resources that it will receive will be used to finance the plans and the projects that the government can decide. They will also have sufficient finance both to invest and generate additional interest for the long-term management of the fund. And secondly, they can also use a bid process to receive additional proposals to be financed by private actors as per their own thinking and decision. I usually highlight also the paid of commissions. There has been $14 million paid simply because of the tender offer. And there has been an additional $18 million paid to those who have facilitated this transaction. We don't know who they are, what type of organizations they are, so the overall beneficiary of the commissions is not yet known, and we continue to strive efforts to receive this information. I would like to know that the entire operation has been a very well crafted architecture of decisions, both by the governments jointly with the private actors. Many of them were unknown till the moment that the debt swap was announced. We understand that should follow standard practices on strategic terms, but it also undermines transparency and effective governance. So just to give you an example, back in 2020, private actors presented the initial proposal. The government endorsed this proposal with a letter, a non-binding letter of support, But again, we don't understand what type of process the government followed to receive different bids or proposals to achieve the same target by different private actors. We don't, and we understand there are many actors offering the same type of service. At the end of the day, this is a financial service being offered, right? I would really emphasize that this is a financial service to buy back external bonds, to manage the resources, and to invest. There is no other thing, right? The major underlying notion of contribution is that those private actors acquiring the new bonds will refrain from receiving the payback. And this needs to be yet confirmed. But there's no philanthropy going on here. There is a financial cost in the transaction. There has been commissions that have been paid, and there is an overall cost of the transaction that reduces the net fiscal net gains. This will be reduced about 200 million. So the major question is, were there alternatives to achieve the same target without compromising the government possibility to make decisions? And when we look at this timeline, back in October of 2002, the designated activity company, and that the special purpose vehicle, was already established in Ireland. So the sunk investment by private actors were already done. And they were just waiting for the moment for the government to have faced the highest political risk possible, so that the face value of the bonds were the lowest possible as well, so that perhaps the transaction could be considered successful in terms of a scale and gains for the country. The Inter-American Development Bank also committed the issuance of the warranty back in December. It was issued now, it was paid by the government in 2023, but it was committed back in 2022, and the conditions are available online. However, the budget for the Marine Reserve that I presented to you was only approved and endorsed in early March this year. And the overall transaction at the end of the day was also considered to be part of the country definition of sovereign bonds. But this decision came back only after the debt swap was realized by the end of July. There is expectation that a full taxonomy for the country to increase regulations will be available in the next 6 years. So to wrap up, first, we need a highly in-depth country with high political risk to be an attractive profile for these private actors that are using public finance to facilitate the instruments, right? The establishment of the special purpose vehicle, the setup of the entire operation demanded about $2 million. These $2 million came in part from public finance. And the three major elements of the debt swaps are the buyback, the new financing, and the swap in itself. And we need to consider how these instruments could be fit for purpose so that they are cost effective and the benefit cost relation works for the benefit of people in the country without increasing burdens on fiscal terms, but also without undermining sovereignty to make decisions, right? In essence, the message that we get from here is that at international level, developed countries finance private actors because they don't trust that we as developing countries can deliver. So they want to be seated on the table where decisions are made about budget allocation to ensure that the resources are used on the terms that they believe are the best. This is the essential message that we are receiving. I'm saying this as a former Minister of Environment. This is an issue of distrust, both from private actors working on conservation, but also from developed nations that may use this vehicle essentially to buy the right to be sitting on the table by the time policy decisions are made. This is in essence what we have. So if we want to scrutinize this and look for alternatives, we need to think about whether they are consistent with national regulatory frameworks, whether they are consistent with international supervisory guidelines for robust governance, transparency, and ensure no conflict of interest takes place, but most importantly, whether the high integrity is delivered and there is accountability on the process. And there can be an alternative to achieve the same. Ecuador could have received a direct loan with better interest without private participants for multilateral banks to go about buying back. We didn't need to have the private actors doing this for us, not offering a tender to buy back. We could have managed it directly, and Ecuador has done the same, perhaps in lower numbers, but it has done the same in the past. Secondly, we could have used the United Nations system with to facilitate the transaction, reduce transaction costs, increase transparency, and ensure robust governance. But beyond that, I think it is important also to engage with private financing, but it could have been worked in different terms, and the majority of voting in the final endowment would have been balanced in favor of the government and not to the private actors. And in particular, the ways to pay back the loan could have been worked differently. There are subsidies in Ecuador. Ecuador is one of the most major, heavily subsidized countries with respect to fossil fuels. But the tourism industry in Galapagos uses these subsidies as well. And I'm talking about very large tourism corporations. We have made a study and research, and we understand that the same amounts that fiscal amounts that have been committed by the country to pay the loan could have been obtained by simply focalizing the reduction of the subsidies on these companies. So this is the balance of this operation. Legally, as we have seen in the timeline, by the time the government made decisions, was already legitimizing what the private actors had already in mind and were implemented in the past. Secondly, we see difficult issues with respect to governance, transparency, and independence. Public finance used for private interests, and at the end of the day, there is an issuance of a bond that does not follow disclosure requirements. So this will associate additional downstream risk to whoever is buying the bond. And perhaps it is why it has not been certified by no one as a green, blue, or sustainability-linked bond. It's simply a claim that has no support. With respect to the integrity, we see that there is a large difference between the accountability that is required by the European taxonomy and disclosure regulations to what we are seeing on the ground, or even the Green Bond Principles recommendation for ESG management. And in economic terms, yes, there is a fiscal benefit, but the trade-off of achieving that could have been realized through different means. And the increased profile of the country because of possible default has increased given the conditions included in the loan agreement. But most importantly, the capacity for Galapagos themselves and the people in Galapagos and the people in Ecuador to define on sovereign basis how they want to confront the development challenges has been significantly undermined, because at the end of the day, private actors have bought their right to be sitting on the table by the time decisions are made, and perhaps kidnapping the government, right? There are many ministers that will be sitting with 2 or 3 private organizations to make decisions along this line. And again, we should welcome private participation and operations, but I don't think it should come to the cost to undermine people's own decisions, and particularly trust developing country governments to work with developing country populations to define what is the best case to do. Let me stop there. I don't want to overextend my time, but thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for going into all these details. I know it's not easy to understand how this mechanism, how this operation has been taken since the beginning, and now in a first assessment of what are the main results, but also to understand the risks and the impacts, not only now, but as a projection. What happens if Ecuador would end up paying more with this operation than the original debt, for instance? So these kind of questions and this kind of analysis are very important, in particular because these initiatives of debt swaps are now being implemented in other countries, in other regions. And this allows me to give the floor to our next our last but not least speaker, who is Adrian Chico-Wore from Latindadd. And we have recently knew about the latest debt swap in Gabon. So Adrian will share with us some comments from Africa, as we know that there might be other debt swap initiatives in the pipeline for other countries. Please, Adrian, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Patricia, and to Latindadd for inviting us. to also share our views with regards this quite increasing trend of debt for climate swaps that we're seeing African countries adopting. We are in very interesting times, given the capacities of some of our governments in engaging in complex agreements of such nature. I see the Zoom platform is requesting me to beam my video, but I might have to decline pending, given the patchy internet connectivity that I have at the moment. But be that as it may, colleagues, Africa is facing the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, an economic crisis, as well as an ecological breakdown. And I believe we cannot afford to lose on any front. We believe that governments and development actors have a unique chance to put countries on sustainable trajectories that prioritize economic opportunity, poverty reduction, and planetary health all at once. But that said, I think it's important to highlight the statistical outlook of Africa's debt. I believe it's very concerning, and the fact that gross government debt has hovered just above 1.4 trillion, whereas general government revenue is just hovering around 400 billion. And this translates to a gross government debt as a percentage of revenue of at around 364%. And that was it is 2020. And we're not seeing this trajectory dropping anytime soon. And when we look at character of the credit 2 decades, we're seeing that the share of private creditors at around 2,000 over at around 30%. 2020, we're seeing it around 44 to 48%. And increase that's also worrying is around Chinese debt, where around 2000 was just 1%, but as of 2020-21, we were talking about 9 to 10%. And this is very concerning within the continent. You know, sub-Saharan Africa as a region is the least responsible for global climate change, but it is the most vulnerable to its the impact rather. You know, we're seeing a multitude of actors involved in directing climate finance to the region, both to support low carbon development and to help countries adapt to the severe impacts that we are seeing. And these include the cyclones, the locust waves in East Africa, the droughts that we're facing as a result of climate change. And it's very worrying to then see that the financial contributions, especially through grant-based frameworks such as the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, we're seeing that between 2003 and 2020, at least 5.9 billion had been approved for around 827 projects to sub-Saharan Africa. And of this amount, only 37 accounted for those going to adaptation measures. And this is very worrying, because I think statistics highlight the Africa Development Bank notes that the continent loses between 7 to 15 billion a year to climate change. And this might rise to around 50 billion as of 2040. And if you see or analyze what we're currently seeing, then you see the challenge that we as Africa are facing with regards to resourcing for climate resilience. So these inadequacies have prompted initiatives with partners or private sector entities rather, in the form of green bonds, the climate for debt swaps that we're talking about, as well as various other PPPs. I think Ahmed spoke about some of these issues with regards to PPPs and bonds. But it is also important to highlight the areas in which African countries have tried to engage with regards to debt restructuring. And you would know we have countries such as Zambia that have engaged in the common framework for debt treatments. And you would see that the processes themselves that countries, including Zambia, Chad, and Ethiopia, got into a very slow, and there were a lot of losses in terms of the kind of agenda African countries had with regards to climate resilience, yet this framework had issues in terms of how it dealt with countries. After all, I think in the Zambian case, we then realized that upon reaching an MOU, it was basically them and China engaging on a debt restructuring kind of resolution. But this is the kind of architecture that we're trying to call for, to then say it needs to be reformed because it is not fit for purpose and it undermines Africa's development, so to say. The special drawing rights, I think colleagues would understand the inequalities around the allocations themselves, as well as how Africa would then get to be allocated 33 billion, yet the kind of challenges it faces are surmountable. I'll not speak around issues of the RST, but maybe the allocation or the kind of proposals being made by the AFDB within the reallocation of SDRs. We still see that vicious cycle of trying to have African countries within these loan agreements that increase access costs to the debt that they already have, as well as the increases per se, because I think at this point, African countries do not need loans, but more of grants, so to say. But then when we get to the issues around debt for climate swaps, Yolanda highlighted that, yes, indeed, these are not new instruments, so to say. I think in the late 80s, we're seeing a number of them coming through. But in Africa recently, over the last 5 years, we have been seeing an increasing trend in the promotion, or that promotion rather, by the World Bank, by the IMF, the GCF, as well as the Africa Development Bank. And we've come across a lot of working papers and scenarios of countries that can be eligible, especially those in high risk of debt distress or those in debt distress already. And you see, despite a few positive examples I should highlight, and maybe also concur with what Yolanda was highlighting with regards their impact, so to say, we see just a few. Maybe the Seychelles debt for nature swap is one that is touted as if it's one of the most positive. But then in terms of amounts of funds actually channeled, you realize that IMF estimates that only up to 3.7 of debt has been forgiven under swap programs. And of that 3.7 billion, you only see around 318 million being accounted to the African continent. That said, there are a number of countries that are toying with the idea of debt for climate swaps. Recently, we saw Gabon, Cape Verde announcing launches of these swaps. But then we're also seeing countries such as Eswatini, Kenya, and Mozambique doing the same. But then in terms of analysis of these cases, one thing I should highlight is the information asymmetry is very limited because there is little data as to what's really happening. That's one. And even with cases such as the Ecuador one and the Belize one, we are assuming already that the complex nature of these swaps will undermine the positions of African governments that are getting into the swaps. Because I think in some of the structures, these debt swaps are characteristic of such frameworks such as PPPs, where you see these special purpose vehicles and various other players being part of the same. So it is a very worrying trend that we are seeing within the African continent. And I should hazard not to even comment on this, because I think for a country that I was recently in, Malawi, I think one top official from the Ministry of Finance highlighted a swap that they were in, and I enjoy would then assist them in the processes themselves. But with some of our governments pointing to some of these things might get some of us in trouble. But that said, you realize that the World Bank, the IMF, the Africa Development Bank are actually coming up with scenarios for countries such as Zimbabwe, where just in the last week there was a statutory instrument that was gazetted around the carbon markets and debt swap agenda. But the kind of consultation that is needed to ensure that the public and the people that are affected by climate change need to be aware of this, and that there is limited information around that. And we might be seeing the same for Chad and Sudan as well. But then I think in closing, I should highlight some of the issues that have been highlighted by colleagues. You realize debt for nature swaps are minimalist in their approach in terms of debt to climate resolution. Those kind of propositions made that they can free up fiscal space for countries to invest in climate adaptation and mitigation projects. Those kind of announcements or propositions are very minimalistic. In that, there are other challenges. I think Daniel highlighted them to then say, they require the participation and coordination of all creditors, including the private and bilateral lenders. They are less efficient than conditional grants or broad debt restructuring, as some of the benefits are accrued to non-participating creditors, and they depend on the timing and availability of funds, as well as the political will and the capacity of countries involved. In this realm, we shouldn't be swayed from the agenda around the reform of the global financial architecture, because they'll sway countries into getting into this when the real challenge is the architecture that we're dealing with, in which even the climate finance architecture fairly mirrors the challenges that we're facing with the very global economy or financial architecture that we're dealing with. I think that said, I'll stop here, but I'll be happy to respond to questions that may arise. But over to you, Miranda.
Thanks so much, Adrian. Also, to put on the table that this needs to have a holistic view to link that climate, but also with other important issues as PPPs or as special drawing rights. So I think this is important also to take into account as having, when we talk about debt resolution. I would like to thank first, I would like to give our warm thanks to all the panelists and all our speakers. It has been really interesting. We received a lot of information. All the participants will receive the presentations. You will receive also the links that we have been sharing in the chat. We have some questions, and I would like to mention them very briefly. I would like to also apologize that our speaker from Ecuador, Daniel Ortega, had to leave. He had another commitment. So one of the questions are about the ecological debt that the North has with the South. And I think this also probably popped out after sharing the link of the declaration. So I would like to ask May from APMDB if you could address this question about it wouldn't be interesting also to link all these debt and climate issues to keep pushing for the ecological debt that the North has with the South. There is another question as well around what is illegitimate debt. And May, if you could address that as well, would be awesome. And there is another question about how to can the debt swap in Ecuador, the Galapagos debt swap, be reverted? And Daniel Ortega is not here anymore, but I would like to change this question so we could open to the other speakers. Probably cannot, and we have discussed this with Daniel Ortega. This cannot be reverted now, but there are other initiatives. We have been listening for given the success of this one, we have been listening that there could be another one for Ecuador, for instance, and there are other initiatives in the pipeline in other countries, not only in Latin America and the Caribbean, but as we have heard, in Africa and probably in Asia. So what can we do as civil society organizations regarding these possible next ones? And I would like also to link this with another question about there is some proposal from Colombia and from other countries, probably in the region, about debt swaps for the Amazon. So what could we say about this? Do we have any recommendations? As we said, that this is not a debt resolution issue, but it could help. It could contribute if it has key principles as a priority in their design. We have also another question about the World Bank that is providing financing for fossil fuels through some national or local banks in our countries. So the question is, this fact plus green conditionalities, how this could be addressed in a best way that it could benefit our people and nature. And there is a final question about how to advocate more around this, around debt cancellation or illegitimate debt cancellation. Is the G77 and China an option for advocacy towards this? Besides, we have seen the data and the trends of debt, and the trends reflect that probably in the next years debt will rise even more. So what to do about this in terms of advocacy? So all these last questions are open questions. I will ask our speakers to address the ones that you would like to answer, that you would like to make a comment on, and I will start in, as we don't have Daniel Ortega now, I would like to ask you to reply to this and give your final comments in the same order. You have 3 minutes for this. Daniel Munevar, please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay, so I think one issue that I think it's important to consider is again the role that swaps plays in the overall financing needs of developing countries, because the issue is that not only developing countries are not getting enough resources, but as the World of Debt report highlights, when they do have access to resources, this access is extremely expensive. So that means that they need to get creative, and this is where basically swaps have come to play a role. Because in practical terms, what has been happening over the last decade, you have a large number of countries that didn't have market access, that didn't have bonds in international financial markets. But thanks to a decade of low interest rates, an increasing number of these countries were able to start issuing these bonds, and they were able to borrow at rates ranging from anywhere to 6 to 10%. The issue is that a lot of the financing that these countries receive through bond issuance is now coming due over the next 3 years. This is a discussion that is going to be included in the next UNCTAD Trade and Development report. So then the problem is that when these countries have to refinance these debts, they are facing the challenge that now, when they look at their current borrowing costs, if they were trying to issue new bonds, they would have to borrow at rates of anywhere above 12%. So then, when they are presented with the opportunity of, well, if you do a debt swap, now thanks to a guarantee provided by either the Development Finance Corporation or a multilateral institution, now you're able to borrow at rates as low as 6%, and then you have to add a couple of interest points on fees. So then you end up borrowing around 8 to 9%. So then this all of a sudden appears to be a very good business. But the key question that everyone needs to be asking themselves is, if countries were able to access the financing that needs in adequate conditions, would they be engaging in swaps? The answer is probably no, because they're very expensive. If the common framework was working as it should have been in terms of providing adequate debt relief and address the problems of debt sustainability of low-income countries, would these countries be using debt swaps? The answer is probably no. So basically, we have a situation where debt swaps are becoming a viable alternative to countries because the things that the multilateral system should be doing, they are not getting done, and that's why this is such a problem. Now the thing is that now we're going into a very critical half of the year, where next month we have the General Assembly, we have the SDG Summit, where it's the halfway point of the discussion it's the halfway point of the SDG agenda, where we're supposed to have a discussion about how to advance towards the achievement of the SDGs, and then this is going to run into the COP discussions for the establishment of a loss and damage fund. And the issue is that unless there is a serious discussion about how to increase substantially the access to concessional financing of developing countries, not only that problem is going to get worse, not only are we going to get further and further away from the SDGs, but we're also going to see more incentives for more countries to veer into this sort of debt swap initiatives. And that is, I think, the real problem that we're dealing with. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Daniel. May, please, your comments and last remarks.
Yeah, so thank you to the question by our colleague, and I did not have time to go into that anymore, but that is really ecological debt. It's really part of the core, the basis of the demand for reparations. This is and we thank the Chilean organization Acción Ecológica for developing this concept of the way that we have been plundered. The global south has been plundered by the global north, and this perspective really turns on its head the way we view the issues of debt and other issues of social justice. So that's what you said. That's what he said also in the comments, that in fact we are the creditors. That is also one of our calls, and that we also talk about the illegitimacy of debt itself having been done or being done in a context of sharply unequal relations between North and South. But we also speak of specific illegitimate debts as a way of building that discourse towards their immediate and unconditional cancellation. So illegitimate debt refers to those debts that are questionable, fraudulent, outrightly illegal, led to the destruction of communities and the environment, violated human rights. And one of our campaigning strategies to bring that out is through citizens' debt audits and official debt audits, which can be a way of involving a large public in questioning the debt, the terms, the benefits, the implementation, the spending, and also really debunk that debt is must be left to the so-called experts and citizens. This gives citizens really a claim on the right to information of the debts that were borrowed in their name in the first place. So thank you, Tricia.
Thanks so much, May. Yolanda, please, your comments and last remarks.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I just support everything that was said by my colleagues. I would like to answer the question on the World Bank green conditionalities, and I think we have to be aware that any kind of conditionalities by an international institution, and particularly non-democratic institutions dominated by the global north, like the World Bank, is an attempt to a country's sovereignty. I think it's fairly easy. The World Bank could just stop funding fossil fuels. They don't need to push for conditionalities in that sense. And one thing is conditionalities, and another thing is obligations, human rights obligations, economic, cultural, and environmental rights obligations. So the World Bank can make sure that the projects it funds doesn't breach the country's obligations with the human rights. That's the extent of it. So I think we should be aware of not asking for any kind of so-called positive conditionality, because who decides what's positive and what's negative? From the World Bank perspective, multinational corporations involvement in development is very positive, and we have plenty of examples on how these corporations have reached human rights. So it's being compliant with human rights. It's a stop funding fossil fuel projects, and no conditionalities, no positive or negative conditionalities. And finally, there is a question about how can we advocate for Global South debt cancellation. We have here May, and together with APNDD and Latindadd and other organizations, we are preparing the Global Days of Action for debt justice, economic justice, and climate justice that will take place in October. So joining us for a broad mobilization in our campaigning and in our advocacy efforts. There is a debt movement out there. Last time we got successful measures on debt, it was because there was a strong movement. So let's build a strong movement so we can put pressure on, as Alicia is suggesting, G77 plus China plus other countries. There are a lot of interesting questions. I think the debt swaps discussion is something to be continued. I think we need to do a lot more research on these new proposals, on these new debt swaps, and on what is actually happening on the field, and be very strong in our demand for transparency, for civil society participation, for parliament oversight, and for monitoring any mechanism, but also any debt new issuance by national parliaments, not by international institutions. I think sovereignty needs to be secured in all the cases. So in the proposal that the Colombian government is making on debt swaps for the Amazon, we need to build those principles on, well, if we want to do debt swaps, be clear they are not a solution for the debt problem. So we need to build solutions for the debt problem, debt cancellation, debt architecture reform, debt audits, as Maya was suggesting. We have the solutions. And then we need to agree on the principles of what would make a good debt swap in case that's helpful for that concrete country. I think both directions can be compatible, and I'll leave it there. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all our speakers, Daniel Munevar, Daniel Ortega, May Buenaventura, Yolanda Fresnillo, and Adrian Chicowore for being part of this panel. We are very happy from Latindadd. We also agree that this is a very timely panel and space opportunity to discuss around these issues. We are happy that we have near 200 participants registered. So this gives us a sense that it's an urgent and timely and very needed discussion that needs to take place between us. I will like to mention as well that we are organizing a cycle of webinars around these topics. You can see here is a cycle of webinars on fair financing. This was the first out of 5. and you are invited to the next one that will be on September 12th. We will discuss about what is the role of international financial institutions on climate finance for the Global South. We will also take advantage to discuss what are the results of the Financing Common, a summit that will take place in Bogota. So you can see here, we will keep you posted about all our next webinars. Thanks for being connected today. This has been a really valuable and richful discussion. I am passionate about that. So as many of you, I would like to talk about this the whole day, but thanks for your time. Thanks for being with us these 2 hours. We will keep you posted and you will receive all the information. Have a nice day. Thank you so much.